This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa and this week I'll be bringing you some bonus content on Modern Horizons. It is a draft innovation set, but it sort of feels like the love child of a master set and a draft innovation set to me. With the format on the horizon, I wanted to get my early thoughts out on the format. I don't do full set reviews for these special sets because they're limited releases and people don't draft them enough to warrant that, but I will be bringing you 3 videos on the format this week, with the first of them coming today in this video, where I'll give you my picks for the best commons and uncommons in the format. Now, let's get started. So I think the third best white common is Settle Beyond Reality. So on its surface, this is a removal spell. Kind of a clunky one, but it does say 5 mana, kill anything, and in fact you exile it, and that does matter in this format that has a lot of graveyard things going on. It certainly matters. On top of that, it also has the ability to blink one of your creatures, and that matters too because there are lots of enter the battlefield abilities in this set, especially in the blue-white deck, so that's probably where this will be at its best. But this seems good even as a splash because it answers anything, and that's really important. Again, it doesn't do it the most efficiently, but I do think it's a pretty powerful common, and I think it's borderline first pickable, and certainly a card that you want 1 or 2 of in every one of your white decks. Worth noting that second effect too can be even more flexible. You can use it to make aura-based removal spells fall off of your creature. You can also use it in sort of a less interesting fashion to make one of your creatures become untapped, sort of giving it pseudo-vigilance. And all of that, when it's tacked onto a removal spell, is some nice additional value, but it'll be the best when you can actually blink a creature with the enter the battlefield ability, and you'll basically be getting a 2-for-1 anytime you can do that. I think the second best white common is Rox Veteran. He's got a lot going on for a little common. I mean, he's a 4-mana 2/4, which isn't the greatest stats, but he comes with that very powerful ability that aggressive creatures often come with, that he can tap creatures opponents control. Oftentimes, tapping down your opponent's best blocker makes it very difficult for them to win combat. And on top of that, he comes with Battlecry, because why not? Honestly, he'd be a pretty good common without Battlecry, or without the second ability he has to tap things. But with both together, he's a great common. The green-white deck especially is going to be good at going wide, and that's probably where he'll be at his best. But I think he'll be good in basically any white aggressive deck, and I do think he's also borderline first pickable with Settle Beyond Reality. I think the two are really close, but this is where I ended up with them for now. So I think the best white common is Reprobation, which is a removal spell. Essentially, it's this set's version of Pacifism. You stick it on a creature, it becomes a 0/1 and a coward, and loses all of its abilities. The coward thing does matter a little bit. We'll see why later on in this video, actually. But most of the time, this is just going to be useful as a pacifism. And, it has some things going for it that pacifism doesn't. Namely, that it makes a creature lose all of its abilities, so if it has a static or activated ability, it's done. It doesn't make the creature unable to block, and sometimes it can be frustrating, because you use this removal spell, and your opponent can still now block with their 0/1, and it's a little bit annoying. But it's still a really good removal spell, and I do think it's one you certainly consider first picking. It's also nice that it's splashable. Now let's look at white's uncommons. I actually think white is more shallow at uncommons than it is at commons, and I think that's kind of true of some of the other colors as well. I think part of this has to do with there are a lot of really heavily supported archetypes in this set, and they used a lot of uncommon slots to support those archetypes, and sometimes that works out really well. But it does mean those cards that are sort of build-aroundy are going to be less first pickable than cards that are just good in any deck. So let's look at white's uncommons. I think the third best white uncommon is Splicer's Skill. For 3 mana, you get a 3/3 golem at worst, and that's not anything special. But if you add Splice onto this, it gets to be a little bit silly because you can just start adding a 3/3 golem to all the spells you play. Even if you just splice this once and then cast it, you're going to be in pretty good shape. I actually don't think I would consider first picking Splicer's Skill. And see, this is what I sort of mean about uncommons being shallow. I said all 3 of the white commons we talked about are things that I would feel pretty good, or at least consider first picking. Splicer's Skill, I kind of hope I don't have to first pick it ever, but it is a card that has a reasonable floor and a pretty high ceiling, and it's a card I'd like to have in a lot of decks. There's also Zhalfirin Decoy. So it's a 2-mana 1/3, and it also comes with the decoy ability of being able to tap a creature down. However, this is much less effective than your average decoy because it has to have a creature come into play to tap something. Most of the time, that means you're going to be using this on your turn, which is nice. Again, tapping down blockers is great, and white has a few ways to do that. We already saw one other one. You can occasionally find a way to use this on your opponent's turn. One way, for example, would be to splice Splicer's Skill onto an instant that you cast on their turn, and then suddenly you get a 3/3 Golem and the Zhalfirin Decoy can tap something. There are other ways to make tokens on your opponent's turn too, but most of the time this is going to be used more aggressively to tap things down instead of more defensively to tap down your opponent's best creature. And I think the best white uncommon is Battle Screech, which is an old favorite card of mine. If you know me, you know I really like birds, but this card's just great anyway. My bias about birds isn't the only thing that's making me want to play this thing. Battle Screech is a lot like Lingering Souls. More people are familiar with that card. The two are both incredible because they make you a bunch of evasive bodies. Battle Screech sometimes can do it a little more efficiently than Lingering Souls. The reason being that its flashback doesn't cost any mana. So initially you pay 4 mana to get 2/1/1 white bird creature tokens with flying. That's already like a kind of playable card in most limited formats. This one has a higher power level, so maybe it wouldn't be very good in this one. But that's not all it does, because then you can flashback and do it again and get 2 more white bird creature tokens with flying. Now, the trick with Battle Screech is paying attention to the fact that the birds you just made are white. So if you cast Battle Screech and you have one other white creature in play, well, you can just flash it back right away because you get those 2 birds who are also white. This means you pay 4 mana for 4 1/1 flyers, and that is an incredibly good rate. This set has lots of payoffs for going wide, and even if you don't have those payoffs, you're presenting a really quick clock to your opponent as early as turn 4. This can just end games on the spot in a lot of cases. I think it is first pickable. I think it's first pickable over all the white commons we saw too. Meanwhile, I think Zhalfirin Decoy and Splicer's Skill are sort of actually beneath the 3 white commons we looked at, but they are pretty good cards. I think the third best blue common is Pondering Mage. For 5 mana, you get a 3/4 who draws you a card. And actually, it's even better than that, because a 5 mana 3/4 that draws you a card would already be good. But this also gives you some huge card selection in so doing. You get to look at the top 3 cards of your library. By the way, you're casting Ponder. That's kind of the joke here. And then you put them back in any order. So if you see something you really want, you put it on top and you can get it. If all 3 things on top of your library are things you don't want, you even get to shuffle them away, which is great because of a lot of effects like this don't do it. Either way, it's a 5 mana 3/4 that draws you a card, and it has some additional value in this set that I think makes it even better, and that's the fact that there is the blue-white Blink deck, which can be able to use this ability multiple times, but also the blue-black Ninja deck. That deck uses Ninjutsu. Whenever you attack with a creature and it's unblocked, you can pay the Ninjutsu cost for a ninja in your hand, return the unblocked attacker to your hand, and put the ninja into play. And this means not only do you sort of get to sneak attack your opponent with a ninja who generally has an ability that does something when it hits the opponent, you also get to play your Pondering Mage again and get value out of it. So you're getting a lot of value out of Ninjutsu when you do that. So there's 2 blue decks where it's already really good, and it's basically going to be good in any blue deck that's not hyper-aggressive. I don't quite think I want to take it with a first pick, but it is a quality common and a very good one. Next we have String of Disappearances, which for 1 blue mana is an instant speed bounce your opponent's creature spell. That's a really good rate. The sort of downside this could have some of the time is that if your opponent also has blue mana available, they can recast it. Now, this can create a chain. In fact, this card is based on Chain Lightning. It's a blue version of Chain Lightning, essentially. But it can create a chain where your opponent then shoots it back at you, making one of your creatures bounce, and then you can pay 2 blue mana and then bounce their creature. But generally, I think it won't be that hard to find an opening where you can use this and your opponent's going to be the one behind. Like, if you have enough blue mana available, them copying it themselves oftentimes won't be worth it. And you can just wait for a window when they don't have blue mana available, and you have a very powerful bounce spell for only 1 blue mana. Now, I do think it is a little weaker maybe in this set than some other sets, and this is because of the fact that there's a bunch of creatures with good enter the battlefield abilities. Like, bouncing a Pondering Mage oftentimes isn't going to feel great, for example. But it is still a really good card, and I do think it's probably in the lower range of first pickable. It's one of the better commons around. I think the best blue common is another favorite card of mine, and that is Manowar. 3 mana for a 2/2 that bounces an opponent's creature is great. So, String of Disappearances, right? When you cast a card like that, you're not actually getting card advantage. You're gaining tempo. Generally, you're paying 1 blue mana, and you're bouncing your opponent's card. That will cost more than 1 blue mana. So you come out ahead there, but you are going down a card, and your opponent doesn't actually lose a card. Manowar is much better because of the fact that it lets you add to your board while also taking away from your opponent's, which in a way kind of gives you a 2-for-1. At the very least, it gives you a creature and tempo, meaning you get a full card sort of out of it, in addition to the bounce effect. And Manowar is great, and for the same reason Pondering Mage is extra good in this format, Manowar is too, and I think Manowar is a pretty solid first pick if you see it in your packs for Modern Horizons. Let's look at the uncommons now. I think the third best uncommon is Exclude. If you know me, you know I'm not usually really high on counter spells. I mean, sure, a lot of them are solid, but there aren't that many that would end up on these sorts of videos for me. But Exclude is one that does, and this is because it's a 2-for-1. Sure, it only counters creatures, but creatures are the most common kind of card in Limited. And the reason it's a 2-for-1 is it draws you a card. So leaving up 3 mana for a counterspell can be a little bit of a pain, and I don't advise like leaving this up early in the game just because you want to try to get your opponent, because oftentimes they'll play something you don't really need to counter, or they'll just play around it and you won't get to counter anything. So the best way to play this sort of counterspell to me is to just sort of wait until the later part of the game, or until any point in the game where you don't have anything to do. Like if you can't play a 3 mana thing on your turn and they play something you can counter, you should counter it as soon as you can. You can't really play a game like you would in Constructed of, well, I'll let that through and then I'll counter something later, because you just don't have as good of a deck essentially in Limited. You can't really count on your deck giving you what you need. So using it correctly and not leaving mana up for it and hoping it works out, because if it doesn't, you're going to have a huge tempo hit. I mean, all of that is required for Exclude, but the fact of the matter is that most decks are going to have 14 plus spells that you can counter with this and draw a card off of it. Every time we've seen Exclude in other formats, it's been great, and I think it will be here too. I think the next best blue uncommon is Fact or Fiction. So this is a cool card from Magic's long past. It's cool that it's going to be in Modern now. And a lot of the times what it basically amounts to is a 4 mana instant speed, draw 3 cards. Now, it's not always going to result in that, because your opponent sort of gets to decide how to divide piles, and they're going to make it so that both piles aren't like great, but if you're still gaining card advantage no matter what. I mean, sometimes you'll hit a bomb and then 4 other cards and you just have to take your bomb, and that's fine. But most of the time it's right to take the bigger pile, especially in Limited, where card advantage is king even more than it is in Constructed. Additionally, this format does have some graveyard shenanigans. The black-green deck does all sorts of stuff with creatures in graveyards especially, and the red-green deck does stuff with lands in graveyards. And Fact or Fiction puts things into graveyards that can then be used as fuel, and it is easily splashable, and it'll be good in those decks too. And I think for those reasons, Fact or Fiction is a nice card, one that I would consider first picking. I think the best blue uncommon, though, is a pretty cool one, and it's a brand new card. Exclude and Fact or Fiction are actually reprints. And the brand new card is Watcher for Tomorrow. So it's a 2 mana 2/1 with Hideaway, which is kind of an interesting ability we've seen before. I think we've only seen it on lands before. But basically, you get to have some card selection, pick a card from the top of your library, stick it under Watcher for Tomorrow, and in this case, the only thing you need to do to be able to get that card is have the Watcher leave the battlefield. Now, it's important to note that it says leaves the battlefield, because that means all those blink effects, especially that are in blue and white, or ninjutsu in blue and black, all of those things let you really abuse this, because when it leaves the battlefield, you get that card back and you get that value immediately. Then you can play it again, you put the card back under it. Now, keep in mind, Watcher for Tomorrow does come into play tapped. So it's sometimes when we have cards like this, they're great because you can play it and it can just trade for something and draw you a card right away. And when you can do that with it, it'll be great. But the fact it comes into play tapped does hold it back a tiny bit, but it's still an incredible uncommon and I think an easy first pick in most packs. Now let's look at Black's best commons. I think the third best one is Headless Spectre, a reference to Hypnotic Spectre, a very scary spectre from Magic's past. So this one's basically a Windrake, a 3 mana 2/2 with flying. That's already like a passable card, although this one does have a harder mana cost with 2 colored mana, 2 black mana. But it also comes with Hellbent, and it's a powerful Hellbent effect. With Hellbent, it means if your hand's empty, you get to do something extra. And in this case, it does what Hypnotic Spectre did if your hand's empty, and that is it makes your opponent discard a card at random. Now, the thing that I think holds back this card a little bit is chances are good if your hand's empty, your opponent doesn't have much left in their hand either. But I do think it's some relevant upside if you have a really aggressive deck that sort of dumps its hand and you can just start attacking your sort of dirtily opponent and they have no way to avoid having to discard a card. It's going to feel great. But, you know, Headless Spectre, while a solid common, certainly isn't one I would consider first picking. But I feel like 2 of these in most of your black decks is going to feel all right. Next up, I have Defile. So this one is sort of dependent on your deck, but I think most of the time, Defile works out in a black deck. Obviously, you don't want to splash this because it gives -1/-1 for each swamp you control. But as long as you're like a 10 swamp deck, even a 9 or 8 swamp deck, as long as you have 2 swamps in play when you play this, which is easily doable if you're playing, 8 or more swamps, you're going to be getting a pretty good deal. And then it just scales the more swamps you get into play. Will there be times where like you're playing your black-green deck and you have like 5 forests and a swamp in play and this is less than good? Sure. but those aren't going to happen that often. Most of the time, it will at least be 1 black to give something -2/-2 at instant speed, which is a great card. So I think Defile is a first pickable card, one of the stronger commons, one of the better removal spells in the set. However, we're in black, of course, and black, at common even, has one removal spell that I think is even better, and that's Mob. So it comes with Convoke. That means that you can tap your creatures to pay mana for it, or essentially pay mana for it. It's not technically paying mana, but you know what I mean. And it's instant speed, and it destroys any creature. So even 5 mana at instant speed, destroy target creature, that would be a card you'd play, especially one that's splashable like this. But if you can get this down to 3 or even 4 or 2 mana, it's pretty great. We had a card a lot like it before called Murderous Cut, where it had Delve instead of Convoke, but the two of them remind me a lot of each other, and they both reduce the cost enough that the card's going to be really efficient, and even when you can't reduce the cost, they're still pretty good. So I think Mob is first pickable. Mob and Defile are both really great commons. Next, let's look at uncommons. So I think the third best uncommon is Sling Gang Lieutenant, a fun reference to Siege Gang Commander. And I think in some ways this is a card that does a good job of representing what I was saying about the heavily supported archetypes in this set. Sling Gang Lieutenant's an uncommon, and it's great in a goblin deck because, it has a goblin tribal effect. You can sacrifice goblins to drain your opponent's life. But it's going to be at its best in a deck with lots of goblins or changelings in it, because those are also in the set and they count as goblins. And for those reasons, I'm not sure I really want to first pick it, but the fact that it's a 4 mana creature that brings into play 3/1/1s, that's not the most amazing rate. But on top of all of that, the fact that you can basically Lightning Helix your opponent immediately, if that's what you need to do. You can pay 4, sack all 3 goblins, including Sling Gang Lieutenant, to drain your opponent 3. That's some serious reach. And then if you have any other goblins lying around, and if you're in black, there are a few goblins in black, there are several changelings in black, it can happen. But I still think I'm less than inclined to want to take this with a first pick, and I kind of want to take something that's better in a vacuum than Sling Gang Lieutenant. But I do think it's a pretty good card, and even if you have 0 other goblins in your deck, it's certainly playable. It's just not really like what I would normally think of as best uncommon territory, but it makes it there in this set because, again, I think the uncommons are surprisingly shallow in terms of cards that are just powerful in a vacuum. I think the next best black uncommon is Smiting Helix, another reference card. This one references Lightning Helix, and I think those are pretty fun references. The set's filled with them. So 4 mana to do 3 to something and gain you 3 life. Also a very good card all on its own. But the fact that it has flashback for Lightning Helix's mana cost intentionally makes it even better. And sometimes you'll end up drafting this and you don't get to pay the flashback. When you don't, it's still a pretty good card. It can hit your opponent, by the way, as well as their creatures, and that's really important. But I would try to just throw a little bit of red and white mana into your deck if you can find a way to do it. Because if you get to use this twice, it's completely absurd. It's an easy 2-for-1. And you don't even need to be running that much red or white mana. It can hang around in your graveyard for most of the game. Then you finally assemble the red and white mana to flash it back, and then you're going to feel pretty good. Mana in this set isn't incredible, but there is mana fixing available that I do think this is all doable. And I think you consider first picking Smiting Helix. I think it's sort of in the lower range of that. And then I think the number 1 black uncommon is yet another card that references an old card, and that's Graveshifter, which references Gravedigger. It does the exact same thing Gravedigger does, except it's a changeling, which means you can sacrifice it to Sling Gang Lieutenant, for example. Also, it can get bonuses from cards that like ninjas and from cards that like slivers, and any other cards that like any creature type. There's a Cat Lord in this set, for example. But yeah, Graveshifter and Gravedigger before it always result in 2-for-1s, at least almost always. Getting creatures back from your graveyard is great, especially when you're adding a 2/2 to the board who can then trade with something. It does get better the more cards you have that have like Enter the Battlefield abilities, the more bombs you have. All of that's really great. One really good example that we have just on the screen right now is you chump block with your Sling Gang Lieutenant, sacrifice it to drain your opponent for 1, get it back with Graveshifter, and then play Sling Gang Lieutenant again. And that's pretty great value. If mana were better in this set, I would probably put Smiting Helix above Graveshifter, because if I thought you could really, really easily flash it back, I think it would go above. But I think as is, I like Graveshifter a little bit more. But Graveshifter and Smiting Helix, definitely both first pickable. Sling Gang Lieutenant for me, a little bit below that. Now let's look at Red's best commons. I think Red's really deep at common. It was hard for me to get this down to just 3. One that didn't make the list is Igneous Elemental. That's one that I think could make the list, but let's go ahead and start with what I think is third best, and that is Quakefoot Cyclops. So this guy's a 5 mana 4/4 who makes it so 2 creatures can't block the turn he comes into play. That alone would be a pretty good card. This is the kind of card that if you have at the top of your curve in your aggro deck, your opponent's probably just dead, assuming you played something on turns 2 and 3. And if you played things on 1, 2, 3, and 4 and then play this, then they're really dead. Because making 2 things unable to block, just like tapping down a creature like white aggressive creatures sometimes do, makes it so your whole board can just attack sometimes on boards it couldn't have previously. What adds extra value to this guy is that if, let's say, you're mana screwed and you're not going to be able to play Quakefoot Cyclops ever, and what you really need to do is find mana, well, you can cycle him, and not only do you just get to be able to cycle him and draw a card to try to dig deeper into your library, he still does something. He makes one thing unable to block, so he probably gets you in for extra damage no matter which version of him you use, whether you cycle him or cast him as a creature. And yeah, I think that ability is the kind that's just going to make a lot of opponents sort of fed up with the game and walk away from the table after you just sort of curve out. They finally feel like they've stabilized and you're like, Quakefoot Cyclops, attack for 8. So yeah, he seems pretty great to me. Would I first pick him? He might be in the lower range of first pickable. He's close, but I think probably not. Next up, we have Pyrophobia, which does 3 damage to a creature at sorcery speed. And then it says, cowards can't block this turn. That, again, may sound sort of like a meaningless amount of text there, like how many cowards are in this set, really? Well, the answer is not very many. We saw Reprobation makes a creature into a coward, and that means that Pyrophobia makes it so that 0/1 can't block, and sometimes that'll matter. But I think the most common thing that will make this nice is all the changelings in this set. They're most concentrated in black and white, but they're all over the place. And changelings are cowards, so guess what? They can't block after you cast this. So there will be board states where you Pyrophobia some X3, and then, one other creature can't block until end of turn, and that feels great. Even if that never happens, even though it will happen sometimes, but if it never happens, Pyrophobia is still an efficient removal spell, and one that's first pickable. Then I think the best red common is Magmatic Sinkhole, which is a removal spell with Delve, because, Delve's not busted or anything. So yeah, it's 6 mana to do 5 to a creature or planeswalker at instant speed. That's already kind of playable. But most of the time, you'll be able to easily Delve by turn, 3 or 4 sometimes. You can even trade more aggressively if you know how to help you cast your Sinkhole, because Sinkhole will kill most things. Delving just really isn't that hard, and that's what we found in previous limited formats, and that's true here. The red-green deck especially is interested in getting cards, especially lands, into its graveyard, so you'll be able to feed Magmatic Sinkhole without too much effort, and it's a great removal spell, and I think easily first pickable. Now, let's look at uncommons. I think the third best uncommon is Alpine Guide, a creature who I think has a really cool design. He's a red ramp spell who searches your library for a mountain and puts it into play. That is not the kind of thing we've really ever seen before. On top of that, he's got solid stats. He does have to attack each combat if able, which isn't ideal, especially because when he dies, you have to lose a mountain. But the fact is, he brings you a mountain, and even if you only hold on to that mountain for a turn, he still ramped you up a mana. And then he's got these decent stats, which could allow him to just get in for damage. He's a 3-mana 3/3. I think some people will fixate on the downside attached to Alpine Guide, but the fact of the matter is there's not actually that much downside. No matter what, you're going to get that mountain, put it into play, and before he has to attack, you'll have an extra mountain, meaning he ramped you up a mana. And then maybe he attacks and trades for something and you lose that mountain, but he gave you 1 extra mana for a turn and traded for something. You're not really going to be upset about that. So I think Alpine Guide is pretty nice. It's also a snow creature. That does matter some in this format, although blue and green are the 2 colors that care the most about snow. Every color has a little bit of snow stuff going on. So I do think Alpine Guide might be in the lower range of first pickable. I'm pretty high on him. I think he's a pretty interesting creature. Next, let's look at the second best red uncommon, and I think that's Firebolt. This is a card we've seen several times. It was printed originally in Odyssey, but we've seen it in Masters sets and stuff, and it's always pretty good. 1 red mana to do 2 to any target, already a great limited card. It also has flashback, though, meaning in the late game, you can do it again. If you draw it in the late game, too, sometimes the right thing to do is just pay 6 to do 4 to something, which obviously is not the greatest rate ever. But when it's 1 card doing all of this, it's pretty good, especially if you can trade for 1 card with it. And you can get 2-for-1s with it pretty easily, too. You can finish off your opponent with it, etc. Firebolt's just great. Also has a little bit of synergy with the fact that there are some graveyard things going on in this set, and sometimes maybe it gets milled or you have to discard it, but then you can flash it back later, and it doesn't hurt quite as much. I think the best red uncommon is Urza's Rage. Like Firebolt, it's a reprint. Most of the time, this is just going to be 3 mana to do 3 to any target. The fact that it can't be countered kind of comes up in this format. There are a few counter spells around, but most of the time it won't. But in the really late game, you can pay Kicker to do 10 to a permanent or player. If you played with Fight with Fire in Dominaria, it's kind of a similar card. I do think Fight with Fire is actually considerably better because it does 5. Granted, it does it at sorcery speed, and its kicker isn't quite as ridiculous. But the fact that Urza's Rage on the surface is just a 3 mana, do 3 to whatever you want, and then in the really, really late part of the game, which can happen. I mean, limited formats vary in speed. This one could be one that's slower, and if it is, I mean, you'll probably kick this once if you play this format a bunch, but most of the time it's just a removal spell. An efficient one, but not one that's that exciting. But I think all 3 of these uncommons are ones I would consider first picking at the very least. Now let's move to green. I think green is actually the deepest at common and the most shallow at uncommon, which is a very strange combination, but here's where I ended up for my best commons. I think Savage Swipe is a good green common, the 3rd best green common. So, you know, it's kind of a cool card flavor-wise. It does stuff with bears, right? If your creature has 2 power, it becomes really good, because your creature gets +2/+2, and then your creature fights. So at its worst, this card is Prey Upon, and in the event you can't pump your creature, and Prey Upon is always like a passable card. One that you play, probably not top 3 uncommon, but one that you play. But the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of creatures in this set with 2 power. Like, I looked that over myself before I did this, especially in green. There's a lot of 2 power creatures running around, and when you can pay 1 to give a creature +2/+2 and then fight something, it's just going to kill things. I mean, granted, that means that the highest that creature's power will get is 4, but oftentimes, that's plenty to win a fight. And, you know, if your creatures are so big that you're not getting the +2/+2 out of it, well, the creature's already good at fighting. So I think Savage Swipe is pretty good. I don't think it's in that first pickable territory. I think it might get close. You know, maybe there's even more 2 power creatures than I'm thinking, and maybe there's one color pair where 2 power is really everywhere. But I already think it's around enough that Savage Swipe is one of the best green commons. Next up, we have Krosan Tusker. This is a card I've really liked every time I've played with it in a limited format. So obviously a 7 mana 6/5, not the greatest thing, but the fact of the matter is it's attached to a creature who cycles for 3 mana. Not only does he cycle, he lets you search your library for a basic land card and put it into your hand. So he doesn't let you ramp, but he does help you fix, and green is obviously going to be the best at fixing, as it often is. And don't forget, by the way, that you don't draw the land out of your library in place of cycling. What this basically says is, pay 3 mana at instant speed, by the way, draw a card, search your library for a basic land card, and put that card into your hand. It's basically divination, but green and instant speed. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not that much of an exaggeration, you know, and divination isn't great in every format, but the fact is, this is a really good card, and in the late game when you're like, man, I really do not need another land, you can just play your 7 mana 6/5, and it can do some work that way. Overall, I mean, I love Krosan Tusker. I love that it opens up your ability to splash, and I love that it's 3 mana, draw 2 cards, or a 7 mana 6/5. I like both halves of that in the right situations. I think more often than not, you use the cycling, and you just play him as a creature in the really late game when why would you bother cycling? So yeah, Krosan Tusker looks pretty good to me. I think he's also in the lower range of first pickable. I think the best green common is Trumpeting Herd, which is 4 mana to make 2 3/3 elephant creature tokens. Now, you don't get them right away, and sometimes, like if you're about to die, that's going to be really annoying. But you pay 4 to get 6/6 worth of stats over 2 turns across 2 bodies, and it's in a color pair, green-white, that is really good at pumping the whole team and getting other benefits for going wide. I think Trumpeting Herd is first pickable. I think it's a great common. The interesting thing is green is really deep at common. It has lots and lots of commons that I would say are like knocking on the door of first pickable, but I actually think Trumpeting Herd is the only one I feel really good about first picking. Now let's look at green's uncommons, which, as I said, I think are quite shallow. I think the 3rd best one is Llanowar Tribe, although I'm not really in love with the card. I mean, if there's a reason to be mono green, this is probably it, because if you can consistently play this on turn 3 and then have 6, 7 mana on your next turn, it's going to be great. But most of the time in Limited, being able to go monocolored is a challenge. If you can do it consistently in this format, Llanowar Tribe will be great. But because of that mana cost, I don't really think it's anywhere near first pickable. I think if you're like going through a draft and your first 3 or 4 picks are all green cards and you see a Llanowar Tribe, then you're like, well, I guess I'll take this and see what happens. But I don't think you would take it early and say, I'm going to force mono green. I just think that's a little too risky. Green has a good chance that it just won't be open enough for you to do that. Now, the cool thing about green, generally, and in this set too, thanks to cards like Krosan Tusker, is you could be like a mostly green deck splashing a bunch of stuff, and then Llanowar Tribe is still pretty good. But as is, the fact that it costs triple green makes me less interested in first picking it. Next up, I have Wall of Blossoms. This is a card I like a lot. It's another reprint. 2 mana to play a 0/4 and draw a card is a better deal than you'd think. It gives you certainly at least some value in addition to the card it gives you. It can often just block a lot of creatures in the early game, and the fact it gave you a card is great. You know, it's exactly Wall of Omens, except that it's green instead, and both of those cards are always serviceable. But again, I don't really think I want to first pick Wall of Blossoms. Maybe ever, but it's a nice role player, and there are ways to blink creatures and stuff in this format to really abuse it. Then the best green uncommon, I think, is Saddled Rhymestag. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that has sort of creature fall, which is the green-white deck's archetype, basically. It has a bunch of cards that say, if you've had a creature come into play this turn, you get to do something. And that, like Zhalfirin Decoy had, it's part of the same color pair, the green-white deck. Saddled Rhymestag becomes a 4/4, and I don't imagine it being that hard to play this on turn 2. Play a creature on turn 3, it's a 4/4, you attack with it. They don't have anything big enough to block it. Play a creature on turn 4, it's a 4/4 again, and you attack with it. And a 4/4 is such a size that it can attack for a long time in games. Now, once you run out of gas, it's just a 2/2, but it's a 2-mana 2/2 with a bunch of upside. That said, do I want to first pick it either? I don't really think I do. That's what I mean by green being shallow and uncommon. I don't know if I've ever done any other one of these videos over any other limited format where I have all 3 uncommons in the set be things that I'm not interested in first picking. Although, as I said at the beginning, there are several green uncommons that are synergistic in really specific decks, and those will turn out to be pretty good in those specific decks, but I don't think you usually want to first pick them. So those are my picks for the best commons and uncommons in Modern Horizon for draft. Let me know in the comments what you think I got right, what you think I got wrong. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of my Modern Horizons content, which includes a couple more videos on the format and then actual draft videos in the next few weeks, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.